Welcome back to codingcat.dev, where we give you cats the freshest dose of dev snacks. Here is Alex Patterson and Brittany Postma. This episode brought to you by Storyblock. Build anything and publish everywhere. Welcome back, everyone, to codingcat.dev. Today on the show, we have Pngwn with us, who is the creator of MDSvex. Hey, Pngwn, how's it going?
Hey, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing great. People might get weirded out. Do you want to just say your real name one time, and then we can go back to Pngwn?
Yeah. I'm Pete Allen. That's my full name.
There you go. It's always such a struggle. I remember one of the first episodes we did was with Swix, who we were just looking at on the repo, and it's like, do I call you Sean? Do I call you Swix? Like, what's happening right now? So it's always one of those fun things. So we want to learn a little bit more about you. So was MDSvex kind of your first major open source project that you built? How did you get into this whole field?
Yeah, I guess it was. I had other kind of projects and stuff, but obviously nothing has taken off like this, I think. Yeah, I've always been kind of MDX was, the React kind of Markdown React kind of combo was the inspiration, kind of without question. And I've just don't like I don't know, I think where I kind of had a really good experience with it was in ViewPress. Like a really old version of ViewPress had, this way you could write Markdown and just include components, and it just worked. And it was such a nice kind of experience to kind of augment your Markdown with these kind of interactive widgets. And we just had a kind of a chat we were in the Svelte Discord, and we were just kind of chatting about it and how it might work and all this sort of thing. And it's actually really straightforward because in Markdown, pretty much everything is valid in Markdown, but HTML is valid in Markdown. It will just get rendered as HTML and it'll be ignored. And Svelte is basically just HTML. So all you need to do is you don't really need to do anything too special to get a piece of Markdown working as a piece of HTML, which will then work as a piece of Svelte, because Svelte will happily compile any HTML. So it's kind of just a conversation of how it could be implemented. And it was, the first version was just a pretty basic, just a bunch of regexes. And it kind of grew from there. For a long time, nobody cared about MDSvex until I kind of did a website with a walking penguin, and then everybody loved MDSvex. Nobody likes the name except me, but that's another topic.
I always mess up the name 100% of the time. I think I'm finally getting used to it. But as you said, it used to be MDX, or is MDX on the React side, and so adding the svelte component kind of in the middle there is important. I think in most cases you do uppercase MD, uppercase X to kind of separate it all back out together. So
yeah, I thought it was fun, but people, I think Rich called me a reprobate for the name, which is very outspoken against the name. But, you just got to double down. You just got to commit.
So here's the famous Walking Penguin site, which has the documentation for MDSvex as well. So let me bump that up so people can see it a little better. So yeah, I think what's awesome about this, we were using Next.js and we had MDX running on that side. We would actually do during compile time, we would actually run it at that phase instead of pre-built type of thing, if that makes sense. On the Svelte side, it's really interesting. As you said, it's kind of like you still run through remark and what's the other one?
Rehype.
Yes, rehype. Thank you. And so it still kind of executes those, but it's all done basically on the server side, and it's super fast and performant. It seems like. So I just want to walk people through the basics, and let's just take a look. So essentially, this walking penguin right here, at the end of the day, in a markdown file, you have just the H1 coming out, some text as you have here, but this is where the magic kind of happens, right? So what does writing something like this actually look like? Is it easiest to show it in the docs, or?
When you say writing, you mean writing as an author using MDSvex, or?
Yeah, so we'll get to this, but on CodingCat, if I'm to write this markdown file and I want to include this penguin component, there's got to be more to it, right? Than just, hey, here's some magic text. Do something
Yeah,
with this, right?
there is. Yeah, you'd need to import it. So one of the nice things about MDSvex, well, I mean, I guess it divides opinion to a degree, but one of the, I guess, difficulties with something like MDX, it has a slightly different syntax to both Markdown and to kind of React. You can have these import statements in MDX, but in MDSvex, it's essentially, it mimics the kind of the shape of a Svelte file. So if you can write Svelte and you can write Markdown, all you need to do is start replacing your H1s with kind of, however many kind of like hashes that you want, and so on and so forth. So if you want to bring in any components, you can just create a script tag and import them. Now, obviously, because so it depends how you use MDSvex on a computer. There are two ways to use it, I guess, but the way it's intended to be used is as a preprocessor. So you write your files, and then you give them their extension, and they're just treated as Svelte files, so they become Svelte components. And when you do that, any kind of plugins that you have will also get kind of executed in that kind of tool chain. So if you had an auto import, because this is a thing in Vite, is this auto import thing where you can kind of use components without importing them, as long as you kind of follow some rules and add some config to your Vite plugin. So potentially, if you use those kinds of things, you could get away with using components that you haven't imported. But in terms of just raw kind of MDSvex, you would. I think there's an example at the very top of the docs of importing a chart component. I think it's just after this section.
Right here.
So like here, you would import a chart, and then you would just use it as a normal component and just pop it in a script tag.
Nice. And that's all typically done, like you were explaining, the preprocessor, in this case, like Vite's running this, and kind of it needs to understand both that this is a Svelte component at the end of the day, but it's also doing preprocessing for front matter and for all of the markdown too, right?
Yeah, so all of that's handled by MDSvex itself. And so this uses Svelte's own preprocess method.
Okay.
So I think in the Svelte Vite plugin, you'd pass MDSvex into the kind of the preprocess kind of, I guess, an object with a preprocess property, and you'd pass MDSvex in there. And then because of how kind of, plugins, the way plugins chain is that, if the MDSvex gets converted into Svelte, and there's a plugin or a transform or something for Svelte, it will just kind of treat it as a normal Svelte file. So it means you can use there's some bugs and some limitations at the minute that will be resolved in a future version. But anything that you can use in a Svelte component, in principle, there's no real reason why you shouldn't be able to use that in MDSvex as well. That's assuming it doesn't actually kind of break MDSvex anyway, because you can't currently use TypeScript in an MDSvex component. But
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. Okay.
Okay.
So I think what we'll do now, I'll take a quick break for a sponsor break, and when we come back, you can hopefully teach me a little more how to use it in CodingCat, since we're shifting over to it. Sound good?
Sounds good.
Cool.
How in the world could I forget about this?
There's no need to freak out. We have Storyblock.
Robert, you're right.
But we still need a plan.
Okay, how much time do we have left until the launch?
24 hours.
Okay, let's go.
We are ready to publish.
So let's get this baby online.
Thanks again, Storyblock, for sponsoring CodingCat.dev podcast. We really appreciate it. Pngwn was just telling us more about MDSvex and how to use it, and we're actually currently using it in the rewrite of CodingCat, and so I had a few questions about it, and I thought it'd be a perfect opportunity to kind of understand like performance and if I'm using it right in SvelteKit, and hopefully Pngwn can show me the light, if you will. So let's dive in a little bit on the structure side first. I'll share my entire window, and we'll see how this goes. There we go. So the way that we have everything kind of laid out right now, let me just minimize everything. So we're actually in a turbo repo because we have some Firebase backend and items. And then within that, we have a SvelteKit project. So pretty simple once we get into the SvelteKit side of things. And when we're in here, I think the Svelte config is probably a decent spot to start kind of everything that we were just talking about. Let me make this a little bigger if we're in code for a while. Then we can kind of bounce back and forth. There we go. So looking at this, one of the things that we had to add was the import to MDSvex. And then on the MDSvex side, we actually had to say, okay, these are the typical MDSvex files, the .svx, but we also want markdown files to work for our setup at least. Hopefully that's okay.
That's absolutely fine, yeah.
Perfect. And so anytime these markdown files or .svx are found, it actually runs through this pre-processing prior to the actual Svelte side of things. So if I go back out, all of our files are actually in our source, and then, which I found a little weird. I wanted it kind of separated out, but this seems to work okay. So source content, let's just start with an easy one. I'm going to open this back up this way just to kind of give an overview. If we go to just our blog, let's say, so you'll notice there's a bunch of like pre-compiling because I have some output here happening. Let's just take a look on the Svelte side of things, how this actually works. So here is my posts. Here's all of our posts that are in here. And if I go to the actual routes page, we have this in our listing, and then we have blog. So in blog, we actually have to go through and grab all of the different posts. And we can do this using Vite, using the import meta glob. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah, I am, yeah.
Okay. This I find interesting, and I struggle with a little bit. And this is kind of where my performance questions start to come into play. So, unfortunately, on the import metaglob, which we're not quite there yet, but you have to import everything, right? So, if you have 1,000 documents in here, I'm kind of curious at what point this becomes too much to run in like a, it's going to end up on a serverless function, and speed and that sort of things becomes kind of part of that. So what we do here on this glob is we actually throw that through this parse module. So here is where the MDSvex kind of stuff starts to happen, if you will. And it's been a while since I wrote this, so forgive me if I'm misspeaking on some of this, but we have to do a couple different checks in here. But the main thing here is this MDSvex. So we take that mod that's coming through, and we say, okay, render out everything that's required for the HTML, but we also want to grab that metadata too. And the metadata that's kind of coming through, I should have opened one of these. Let's do the install tailwind. There we go. So the metadata is actually all of this front matter up here. Mm-hmm. So it's taking a look and saying, okay, all of this, the biggest key for us at this point is the slug that's coming through. So that's this right here. So let's jump back over there. And so when that kind of comes out, we end up with just a list of HTML and front matter based content, which comes back over here. We do this list content thing, and all of that data gets pushed up to the website essentially. So this all happens on the server side. And then in our page, we just pass data over. So pretty simple at this point. One thing I've always wondered on Svelte, and I haven't dug into it, if I'm passing around that much data, is all of the HTML there as well when I do that?
In that case, probably, because that's the data structure. But you could, I guess you could potentially do, in this case, do you need the HTML at this point, for example? So
I've been thinking like I should just delete it out of the object and then kind of, hey, just keep going past that, because I don't. I've just left it kind of simple because of this.
Yeah.
So the next step that we do, because this now understands the slug, we can actually open this file. And the interesting part here, so let me go into our single folder here at this point. So we have this content single non-course because course does some special work, but we get into the post side. So on the post side of things, just looking at this top one, for instance, uh, again, we have to do this whole go fetch all of the post data again and grab the slugs out. So the first question I have is, do you think it makes more sense to like have this cached somewhere, maybe using like Vercel's new like edge caching, or like, I don't know. I just keep going back and forth on performance to keep ripping through all of these post markdowns and having to parse it every time.
That's a good question. I mean, what one I guess a question I have
Yeah.
is doesn't SvelteKit? I mean, I guess it's some interplay between SvelteKit and its adapters.
Yeah.
Doesn't it kind of have some HTML caching? In which case, does this? I guess maybe the server code always gets executed though. But I mean, I do wonder if it could just like serve down some HTML, or if you could kind of pre-render them, because it's kind of relatively static content with the whole pre-render.
Yeah, and I think I've had a decent amount of success with the pre-render side of things. Currently, I have that off just in our example here. And the only reason for that is because we have everything wrapped in a Firebase. So if you're logged in, it does different things. So on the server side, it says, hey, block you from courses and stuff like that. We can work around that. And I've got a branch out there that kind of does that. But I've just been wondering, like, okay, if I do like pre-render it all, even then, is it like performant enough where we probably wouldn't have to get into? And I know I'm like, we're not the Washington Post, but if you were, like, you might start to have those kind of questions, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this is one of the big trade-offs with a tool like MDSvex, and it's probably the thing that bothers me the most, and it's something that I want to it's probably the thing I want to work on the most after I'm kind of currently rewriting for a 1.0. But there's a whole kind of missing piece around performance, and so what you're doing here is you're doing stuff on the server because because it's like the sensible place to do it. It allows you to put your posts in a more sensible place, rather than having like all of your blog posts as actual kind of roots in Svelte,
Right.
which would also work. Preprocess would do those, but you'd obviously need to put your posts in a very specific, SvelteKit specific structure. I think in this case, what you could do is you do so import meta.glob does get all of the posts, but because import.meta.glob is returns an object, and all the key value pairs are the file name and an import function, a function that will return the module. So it's not, at that point, it's not been loaded. So what you could do is look through that object and only pull out the one that you care about, rather than processing everything. Obviously, for the other route with the the listings, you would need to process them all together.
The interesting part, or the hard part in that scenario, is still, if you don't base it on file name, is I still need to find all those slugs to be able to find the correct one. So that's something that I've kind of gone back and forth on too, because I think I could get some performance back if we just kept the file name slug equal and like search it by file name or path name or whatever you want to say. So that's something I've been considering as well, because then you wouldn't have to do the whole module. I can't remember what that actually does when you parse through those. So the lack of words, just compile, I would say. I don't know a better word for it. So once it's doing that, so that is something that I really have been thinking about too. It's fun though in some contexts, because we have certain files, like in courses, if you want to repeat a lesson name or something like that, well, then we want slugs to be different. So it's a little bit messy, but a little bit tricky too. So I guess with all of that said, it seems like it's performing pretty well at this point. Early on, I had all of the globs coming in at one point. So I had our posts, our tutorials, our lessons, like everything coming in at one time. And then it was like, okay, it's cached. And what I realized was, if you hit that, I had them coming in at basically the Svelte layout page. Well, if you do that one time, it's fine. It's super slow, but then you get like all that nice cashness past that. Or the trade-off is don't do it all at once, and every route that we're at, break it down a little further. So unfortunately, that import metaglob doesn't allow dynamic. If it did, like we'd have a whole different setup going on. So it's kind of a painful piece of the Svelte kit / Vite journey that we're on.
Yeah, and I think performance is always a concern. So I guess for like a lot of people, I mean, I don't know how well understood this is. Obviously, one of the nice things about MDSvex, or hopefully one of the nice things, is how simple it is. So you can just do your thing. You can plug in the preprocessor. You can just like write your markdown files as if they were Svelte files, and you don't need to worry about too much. But realistically, there is a trade-off here because if you think of a traditional blog setup where you've got markdown that you're basically just injecting into the page, you'd use like @HTML tags in Svelte. In other frameworks, you'd do something hopefully similarly performant, and it's just like that's fast, right? Like there's nothing faster than the browser's built-in HTML parser. It's just strings. It doesn't get much quicker than that in kind of JavaScript kind of web world. When you use something like MDSvex, and this kind of applies to many different, like it doesn't really matter kind of like what it is. If you're going to treat content as JavaScript modules, there's a huge overhead there, and because all of a sudden it's like a bunch of JavaScript that needs to execute. In the case of kind of Svelte and SvelteKit, it's there's creating DOM elements and all of that sort of stuff. There's hydration after the kind of like SSR has been rendered. So if you're not using kind of MDSvex for its dynamic stuff, if you're not using any Svelte features in your markdown files, by far the best thing that you can do is just kind of render the HTML and treat it as HTML. Only when you start actually using components in your markdown or using Svelte syntax in your markdown that you need to kind of actually use it kind of as intended for its full capabilities. But even then, again, this is something I would like to solve in a future version, or try to solve. I mean, it needs some combination of tooling. MDSvex and the tooling need to work together in some way to make this work. But basically, it would be really nice if you could, use MDSvex, and when the content was completely static, it was just a blob of HTML that was injected. And when it was using dynamic features, it was a JavaScript module, because it needs to be in that case, I think. Yeah. And I think that the big challenge is, like you talked about scale, is if you used it as intended as just a pure preprocessor, then your roots manifest is going to be kind of this huge, it's basically just a mapping of like paths to or root patterns to JavaScript modules. Well, that's going to be enormous. It could potentially have thousands of entries. You'd have like megabytes as your first page load, so that's no good. And I think the server approach of actually parsing a module and passing it down and kind of instantiating it in some way is the right approach, but it's also kind of complex for users as well. So I think that's like there's definitely some integrations with, whether it's SvelteKit or whether it's like, I don't know, Astro, or whether, whatever it is that people are using, there's definitely a missing piece there, because I think it's easy to use, but I think to use it at its kind of best and most performant and all that good stuff requires the most difficult implementation. And there's some stuff that's just probably not possible right now due to how things are written and the lack of integrations and stuff. So it is always a trade-off, and I think there's a limit to what you can do at the minute. There's no way to really tightly integrate with SvelteKit. There's no like SvelteKit specific plugins. You can't hook into SvelteKit's kind of bits and pieces. It's nuts and bolts. There's Vite and there's the preprocess and there's various server hooks and stuff, but that's about as much as you have at the minute, as far as I'm aware anyway.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah, the hooks thing, you kind of have my mind. That's interesting. That might be a good solution too. I'll have to look into that. And my mind's kind of churning a little bit now that you say that.
Yeah. I feel like there's some integration that can make things a bit nicer, I think.
Yeah, I think I felt the same way about MDX when it first came out. Like there was just things that needed to occur, and then they started happening, and then I think they jumped a whole version, like 2.0 or something like that. I was like, oh yes, this is how it should have been. So it's been really great to hit that. The next part of my big question and fest here is I've only been using the markdown, and we've kind of went down the road of doing a couple things to avoid having to create a first component. And now I'm like, all right, it's time. Like I need to create one. And so it'd be awesome if you wouldn't mind at least attempting to help me create one, and we'll see how far we can get. Does that sound
Yeah,
good?
sounds
Okay,
good.
cool. So I opened up my lesson file. And so with this, let's see if this might be a better view, a little bit bigger for everyone. So basically what we're looking at on the left over here is this markdown file. And it's got a few things in it. Things that can stay at the same place are like the cover file for it, which you'll see out on, let me go back to this page. On this page, so you'll see like the cover photo, and this comes through on OG image and stuff like that.
Okay.
Inside, it actually says, okay, if you have a video, show the video iframe. That part's fine. The next part that gets a little trickier is this iframe for our stack blitz. And I want more than one stack blitz or code pin or whatever as we go through this. So currently we just have this in the front matter, but ideally I'd like to start to include stack blitzes all throughout our markdown or HTML part of the markdown, if you will. And so right now what this looks like is this right here for stack blitz is just this simple iframe all over the place. So what would be awesome is if we could walk through how to switch this out to create an actual component. Sound good?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. Cool. So what's the first step? Would you attack this just creating a new svelte component, and where would you put it?
Yeah, I would create a new component. And I guess it depends. Like if you've got somewhere that you've been putting your components, I guess like lib is because of the nice, easy inputs.
Yeah,
would be
maybe
like,
just in the lib content. This is
Yeah.
another content thing. So we'll just do templates, I guess.
yeah.
And if we just wanted to show, I guess, a working version of this on this page, before I get too carried away, I'm just going to actually create a new branch because I don't know what I've been doing on here. Sure. Something like that. Okay. So I'm going to take and basically take this iframe out and then put that in up here. And so really the only thing we need in here, I think, is maybe a title for it, but honestly just the source for it. So we'll export let stack blitz. Let's do that one, and maybe an export let title, something like that. And we should be able to swap these out. And so this you kind of piqued my interest. If I wanted to switch this over to, you know what, let me make this a little bigger for everyone too. I wanted to switch this to use TypeScript. Is that something that's not going to work very well?
That's fine. You just can't use TypeScript in the MDSvex file.
Gotcha.
So,
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. So this will be okay.
Yeah, it should be.
We'll find out, right?
Yeah.
So these I can start to say things like this, hopefully.
Yeah.
Cool. So that works. So now we have a component we should be able to utilize throughout. We could even test this out by swapping this out for now and try this out.
Yeah, so this should work.
That one.
Yeah.
I should have left this and copied some of the title and stuff. I already forgot what it was.
Data content something.
I think it was, yeah. So source. You know what? Yeah. I'm just gonna back this train up. There we go.
Yeah.
We've got this and this. Shrink this back down a little, and then make sure this import comes in. And then we should be able to just take that out. What's this complaining about? Oh, right.
Yeah.
So theoretically, if we go look at this page, okay, everything's groovy still. We're sitting pretty good. So ideally at this point, we need to take that stack blitz component and say, hey, MDSvex, you can use this. Where do we add components?
So I've got a feeling, just my gut says this isn't going to work, but
Okay.
the way, at least not without some tweaks. But essentially, in whatever kind of markdown file you're using, you could just add, you could just import the component and use it the same as you are doing here.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So
Wow. Okay.
now, the reason I don't think it's going to work is because I think I mean, I haven't looked at the implementation in detail, but I think you're treating the markdown as kind of static HTML.
For the most part, yeah.
Yeah,
I think even inside of here, we can probably see right here, we have this.
Yeah. So, and so what's going to happen is I'm guessing your path module kind of does some kind of it gets the so it's because we've dynamically imported them, they're being passed through Vite's kind of pipeline. So everything gets converted first from Markdown into Svelte and then from Svelte into JavaScript. And so you're left here when you pass that module in, what you've got is a JavaScript function which has a render method on it. And it's because it's executed in the server, it's the SSR version, so it gives you the static HTML. So the problem is, and this is the complicated stuff I was talking about before, is that's not enough because the static HTML doesn't contain all of the client side code. So you need both. So what SvelteKit does, I mean, it's the reason these meta frameworks are so popular is it'll do the SSR compilation, it'll do the kind of the client side compilation, it will, run the server render stuff, and then when the client is loaded, it will then load up all of the the client side Svelte code and hydrate everything. So what's happened here is because we've kind of gone outside of SvelteKit. We've got the SSR code, we've got the kind of the raw HTML.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have the client side code to hydrate it so that you get a nice. Now in this case, I think it might actually I've changed my mind. I think it might work because it's just because none of those values change.
Yes, that's true. They should.
I think the SSR version should be the full iframe with the correct source.
Yeah,
so I think in this case it would work. But if it were I don't know, say in one tutorial you actually wanted to embed a Svelte demo of something someone had actually built, for example, and it was an interactive widget, none of the code to make it interactive would either in that case.
Interesting. Okay. So you're penguin walking, that probably would work because you don't interact with it.
It depends. Basically, if it needs JavaScript to run, it's not going to work.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
If you can work with just the raw HTML, it will work. So I can't remember how I implemented the Penguin, but if it's just CSS, for example, that would work fine.
Right.
But if it were, and this is why if you just if your MD, whatever you've called your MDSvex files, but if those files are actual roots, SvelteKit will deal with the whole do server stuff on the server, do client stuff on the client, and whereas when you go it alone, you've got to do it manually, and that is somewhat. But it's a bit it's dangerous anyway when you start to do SvelteKit's job for it separately. But it's also very complex because you'd need to compile twice and then find everything. And
are you saying that if we weren't using this content folder and bringing stuff in and just drop that inside of the correct routes, then it would go a lot smoother?
Yeah, and you wouldn't need your parse modules stuff at all. I mean, it would. There is a performance implication potentially. I mean, I've never seen anybody complain about performance, but I know that at the right scale, having a root manifest like that big potentially could be kind of problematic. But Yeah, so if all of your different types of content were actually inside of the root instead of having like a server handler to do it all,
Mhm.
everything would just like work.
Interesting. So
Yeah,
that's a really good note. Do you want to try to go down this path anyways and see?
yeah.
Okay, sweet.
Yeah.
So let's see. When we go to use this, is it in the Svelte compile that we need to set it up? Or the svelte.config?
No. If you just go
We just-
into your so you are going to need to import your components anywhere you want to use them. That's the only
Yeah.
thing. So Svelte, like there have been requests for an auto import on the MDSvex side, which I mean I don't use them personally, but
Sure.
that's possible in the future. And it's possible that one of the auto import plugins that exists for Vite in general might work. But
Okay.
for the vanilla case, if you go and find your markdown file,
Okay.
that kind of corresponds to this page, and just underneath the front matter, you can just create a script. And
And we have
then
to do the same import that we did up here.
yeah, and just import that. And
Will the relative path work?
that should be fine,
Okay.
I think. It all gets passed through kind of Vite because it's a glob import, so it should be fine.
Okay.
And now you should just be able to use your stack blitz.
So theoretically, we should be able to put the same code.
Yeah.
And for now, I'm just going to comment that one out and comment this out so we don't have anything actually leaking through. And
Yeah.
then we'll throw this at the top and change out the data from here to here. Theoretically.
Yeah. And your title as well, I guess. Is that?
Oh yeah, that's true. I think it's just really doesn't matter, but yeah, we'll just do that.
Yeah, so
Something like that.
I think this should work. Famous last words, but
Let's see, script. Yeah, that would totally make sense to have.
what did it say? Oh, okay. And
There we go.
there we go.
I mean, I really didn't think it'd be that easy, quite honestly. So that's great.
Yeah, so in the case of static components, so you're almost like using this like you might use a shortcode in something like Go or some of those things.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I've been thinking of, is just using shortcodes essentially all over the place.
Yeah, and I think like for this kind of use case, there's a few ways to go about this. There are different approaches to it. But this essentially we still only need to deal with a static HTML page. So in this case, and as long as your use case is things like abstractions for, in this case, stack blitz, YouTube videos, maybe there's other little kind of static widgets you might want to display, and it would be absolutely fine for those things. And it would just offer a nice, so you're not littering your page with iframes and all of the ridiculous, attributes you have to pass to an iframe. So it's a nice abstraction. It's just that case of if you want something truly dynamic, like a data visualization, an interactive data visualization, which might be something you'd want on a news article or something like that. It was one of the use cases I had in mind when I originally kind of wrote MDSvex was those nice kind of, scrolly telling or data visualizations embedded inside of cool blog posts and stuff. Yeah. In those cases, you need to go the whole hog. And in this SvelteKit case, it's easier to just give SvelteKit your markdown files as roots. That's going to kind of be the least painful.
Gotcha. Okay.
But in this case, where the shortcode kind of case, it doesn't matter because we don't need JavaScript for them to work anyway.
Yeah, and I guess to that degree, would you actually suggest instead of creating Svelte components, would you do this through like Remark instead, where you set those up?
You could do. I don't think it matters much, to be honest, because Svelte's SSR and a Svelte component is incredibly fast anyway. So the benefit is it happens ahead of time, and 0 is better than any other number. And I think so. My gut says that the Remark, like, no, there are probably a bunch of Remark plugins that like do this kind of thing, Remark or Rehype plugins. But my gut says that the what's it called, generic the generic directive extension, which is a semi-official kind of, it was a proposal to the actual Markdown spec. But what it is it's essentially a set of syntax for this use case. It's almost like a placeholder Markdown that you provide kind of these functions for, and the function, and depending on its name, it will kind of it will say like, oh, you've got a handler for YouTube, you've got a handler for Stackblitz, you've got a handler for this. And what it does is you can pass some kind of parameters in a kind of a Markdown-ish syntax, and then use those parameters to render something. So in the case of Stackblitz, you could pass in a title and a source URL, and then render like a static bit of HTML. And I feel that the generic directive extension feels like a natural fit for shortcodes. It's almost like Markdown's answer, like to shortcodes, in things like Hugo and stuff. And like I say, it's not like getting anything to change in the common mark spec is impossible, but it is as syntax goes, it's something, it's very kind of Markdown like. I'll find a link to I think there's a what did I say it was called? Generic directives Markdown. And I think there's a remark plugin for it. The only problem is you need to be pinned to an older version of Remark at the minute because of some internal reasons inside of MDSvex. And I'm not sure because I think the generic directives plugin is newer and requires a newer version of Remark than you can get away with. Yeah, so there's an issue pinned somewhere about don't go above X version for that reason. So it might be a little bit problematic at the minute. But this is the I'll just pop this in the chat in case you want to link it. But it's and you can take a look at the syntax, but it's essentially like you use colons almost as fences, or you can use it in different ways, but in the same way that you have like backticks to wrap code, this uses colons to say, okay, this is a generic directive. And then after the colons, you would have a name, and then you can kind of potentially pass some parameters. And there's some examples, example applications with the different ways you could use it. And it's quite a nice, it's a nice proposal because it supports kind of inline things, and it supports, wrapping content. So if you wanted to pass something into, what comes to mind to me is like an info block or a warning block in documentation, you could do like : info, and then the actual content you want inside of that container could go inside. But this is the kind of syntax, so it's a kind of a Markdown like syntax. So this leaf block would be the good Stackblitz alternative. I think you do Stackblitz, sure, and then you kind of pass in some parameters.
Yeah, I like this better than like the Dev2 setup with their I think it's the old does GitHub have it? I don't know. Someone else has the old liquid tags the way that they do. I think it's like curly brace and then percentage sign type of thing. So
yeah. So I think this is more. It feels like Markdown.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So this is something that I'm going to build into the next version of MDSvex anyway. Just
nice.
Like
I love this.
Yeah, and so you would essentially have like whatever you call it, your name, somewhere in a configuration file somewhere, you would have like a handler for that name, and then you would kind of receive the parameters as arguments to a function, and you just return the HTML you wanted to render. Cool. So it's quite straightforward. Like I said, whether or not there's something that would allow it to be used in MDSvex today is something you'd have to kind of try. I've not tried myself personally. Okay. It might be that there's a bit of a versioning kind of mismatch.
Sure.
But the component way works fine. And I think like because like, there's not a lot of overhead when you're SSRing a salt component anyway.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense.
I wouldn't be worried about that. But yeah.
Okay, I think while we were chatting, I just threw together another component. I just wanted to give this a try and see what happens. I can't guarantee like what's going to happen, but we'll see.
Okay.
All right. So I just threw together this thing called buttons, and it shows the added amount once you click on it. So on the left over here, and so it's in that same setup in the Markdown. So we're going to do the same import style and everything called buttons instead of this. we're just gonna do this right here. And see what happens. Okay, so the top one is the one that's actually built into the lesson. We'll take that out real quick. Okay.
Okay.
Here's the bottom big button. And as you said, perfectly rendered. The JavaScript is not having it. I wonder if it throws an error. Do you think it throws anything?
No,
It
I don't
just
think
doesn't
there'll be
care.
any
There's no hooks getting lined up, right?
Yeah, so the normally Svelte would kind of like look through the DOM and say, oh, that's mine. I'm going to kind of claim that. I'm going to add the event listeners because all the code is like, and in this case, the code to do that isn't even being loaded in, let alone instantiated, because we're never even generating that code in the first place because we're only generating the SSR because we do our glob on the server. I think that's not like, there's obviously a bit of magic going on there, but I think because we're doing that glob on the server, we only have the server, Svelte has 2 compile modes, and in this case, we're only getting the SSR one. So we'd need to, I do actually want to see how, like I couldn't even begin to guess what the actual code would look like right now, but there's got to be a way where, you can do both, whether it's some extra plugin or some extra setting or something where you can kind of like generate both the client and SSR and somehow map them together. But I do feel as though, I don't know, it's almost like I'd need access to maybe the manifest inside of kind of, and SvelteKit's manifest would have some information about it or something. But my fear is that you would need to somehow hook into almost like add an additional handler to like the root config or something to make something happen in response to this root loading, and then there's all the cleanup and stuff as well. So that's I think that's the big the big trade-off. And then if you go all like root like root files and stuff, then it's like you don't have the control over your source code that you want. People like to put their content separately.
Yeah, I'd almost hot take. That must be a hot take alarm. I don't know.
Yeah.
If they break down your door, I'm sorry, but I'm gonna have to keep recording. It'll be amazing.
It wasn't me. I didn't do it.
What was I gonna say? I totally lost it. As far as when you set up the root files like that and stuff, I think it'd be really interesting as well to have a way to still do like the glob style up in the top. So I think I'd almost move the content into each layer and let Svelte do its thing. But there's trade-offs like we're kind of talking about with that too. And I feel like there's almost performance issues on that side too. And like you have to start to consider package sizes and things like that. So it's kind of an interesting scenario to get into, but I think I might even think about getting away from the glob import for Vite at that point for like the listing files as well. I think I'd probably just go straight to like a directory read of some kind or something. So I don't know. That's tough though. Like that front matter read, you still kind of want it. So,
but you could do that. You could potentially do that ahead of time.
Yeah,
you could
that's
just
true.
grab the file contents, and you could run, instead of running kind of MDSvex as a second export, compile, and it will. And if you kind of iterated through all the files that you read in, you do this at build time or something, you could iterate through them, compile all the files, pull out the I was going to say the dark matter, the front matter, and stick them into a JSON
I like
file.
dark matter too. We should have named it that.
Rename it. I'll rename it.
Yeah.
And you could pop that into a JSON, and then you could read that into the server, and then you basically not doing any work.
I wouldn't even thought of that. So we're actually doing. Let me show you another file. Now that you say that, this becomes super interesting. So, let me pass. This could be easier than I even thought it might be. So if I go to our content JSON, so we actually have, let me show it before I actually try to explain it. So this is our search that comes in, and I can search for like things like Svelte. And this is all in memory, but it's based off of this content. And this is SvelteKit docs. If you ever check them out, this is what this is using. So where is that? Right here. So this content.json, we're actually doing the same thing here. We have all these different metaglobs, and we're just saying, the parts of that we need, essentially the text in this case, It's basically just a JSON file of, hey, here's where a site's structured like. So if we just did that at build time, now we have all the JSON we really need for the searching capability. And then I could put all of the content. So this folder of stuff, we can move that directly into the root. And I think we're done then. Then we can put Svelte wherever we want, right?
Yeah.
That gets really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's like, well, like, I think when you start, SvelteKit does so, like all of these tools do, whether it's Next.js or, Nuxt or whatever, but SvelteKit does so much, they do so much to optimize everything for you that like a lot of the problems you think you're going to have, you end up not having because there's so much optimization happening. It's doing things ahead of time. It's got really clever caching. It's like we're trying to run as little code as possible and remount as little, as infrequently as possible and stuff. So a lot of the times you think you might have problems and you like realistically you don't. And especially when you consider, I've always cared about performance, but I don't think we should care about performance to the detriment of like getting stuff out there and building products and, writing blog posts and courses and all that sort of stuff. Content is more important. And, when you consider your users, like in your case, for example, I imagine it's a lot of, technical users running on like decent hardware and stuff. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't make our stuff accessible to as many people as possible. We should. But I do think that like prioritizing getting stuff out and then waiting until you have a problem before you try to fix it. I think there's been a lot of rhetoric recently with Quick and with like Solid and like various other things about almost this fixation on performance. And I think that's good. But I don't like it when we fixate on performance to the kind of like the detriment of other things. And I think, sometimes it's these tools that we're using. We're very fortunate in the kind of JavaScript ecosystem now that it's such a rich ecosystem. We've got so many options, and that these tools have become like incredibly complex. Go and read the source code. They've become very mature and very complex, and they're actually doing a lot for us now. And to the point where, like I say, you think you might be having a problem, then it just never kind of manifests. That's why it's always good, I think, to just try things out and see if you have a problem before, like, thinking what's, a problem you had like 2 years ago. Might not be a problem anymore. So
I think part of this too is that I think I went after MDSvex the wrong way too. And so maybe I'll do a video for that you can put like in your docs so that I attacked it like, okay, I can parse a thing, but I didn't realize like if I put it in the route, how am I ever going to list it, right? And I think the listing side really threw me off. Like even if I was doing this in Next.js, it's like, well, sure, it'll show all these markdown files perfectly. I can have my layouts, I can import, but at the end of the day, like, how am I going to actually get this to like show a posting page and like iterate through and like all those things? And I think I approached it that way before I showed a single file, and it would have probably clued me in a little more like, oh, if I just left all these front matter markdown files like out in the routes themselves, then worried about the listing part of it, I think I probably would have done this totally differently and not had to worry about the meta glob imports and stuff like that. So it's kind of one of those I literally just had during our podcast here, one of those aha moments, like, it'd be nice for someone to say, here's the right way to do it, or not the right way, but here's the way that we would normally do this. If you have other ways, kind of continue from there. And I know there's going to be other ways because like at one point I was storing all of our MDX up into Firestore and then compiling it after we were pulling it out of the database. So like that's another option to throw in there too. So this actually, I think mentally where I was at was that database type of feel where I'd have to compile once we pulled the data. So I think those kind of things, if we were to put best case scenario or like straight out of the box scenario and then work into the rest, it might be useful.
Yeah, I think it is interesting because I actually see this a lot where people will say, okay, I'm using it, but my components aren't working or something.
Yeah.
And then I was like, hold on, can you show me, like, do you have a repo or something? And then they'll show me, and it's a similar situation where they're doing everything on the server and returning kind of just HTML. And I'm like, It's like, what's happened? Like, and it's obviously, so my opinion on these sorts of things is like, if you see something happening all the time, it's like it's your fault, my fault.
Well,
it's the way the docs are written, or there's something about the tool that encourages that use. And like you say, it might be that there's no obvious solution to getting something like a list of posts or get accessing a front matter. And it's kind of interesting because I don't know if you're familiar with it's kind of like it was a router, but also kind of a framework called a Routify.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. One of the things that actually was really nice about it was it basically allowed you to do this. So it kind of, I think it supported MDSvex out of the box.
Yeah, we had them on the podcast not that long ago. It's really cool.
Yeah, and you could get all that front matter data just by like they had some utilities to do it. And obviously in this world you have to do it all yourself. And I do think maybe there's some patterns there. And I think the other case that you mentioned, using a CMS or using a database, it's a question I've had. How do I put all of my MDSvex stuff in a CMS and then render it dynamically somehow? And I've never really had like a really great answer. So I think there's definitely room for more in-depth kind of recipes on the docs, which I do want to overhaul when I rewrite and have more like integrations and potentially even write some kind of tighter integration with SvelteKit. And potentially this is one of the problems that maybe could be solved by some utilities in MDSvex itself.
Yeah, 100%. Like some sort of like command line even to say, do this, and there it is. It'd be really neat to like make a command for create a front matter markdown file with the correct front matter too. I've been researching like Tina CMS and like the Netlify CMS, which is now something else CMS, can't even remember, starts with a D. And it's like, it's really tough still if I want like a content person, a non-technical person to write blog posts and stuff. I'd love to tell them like, here's an easy way, like type this command in and boom, now start writing like in this file. Like they're usually savvy enough they can open up VS Code and start, typing away in Markdown. So it would be kind of cool to have that still. But anyways, we're crazy down a path, but I'd love to help you rewrite those docs. So keep me in the loop when we're going through this rewrite for sure.
Absolutely. Cool.
We're gonna shift now. Thank you for all of the details in there, but we're gonna do some perfect picks now, and yours are so much fun. I'm just gonna do mine and then let you talk about yours because I feel like we could be on them for like the next hour. So my first pick, if I can show my screen, there we go. My pick is Zeta.io. So it's really cool how they have this serverless database set up and how it works on the edge. I should probably just show the video because I'm not doing it justice at this point. But the amazing part for me on this one is the database branches. So you actually can write in your like GitHub, you'll have basically like if you have a Alex branch that you're going to do and it's going to push out to Vercel a preview. Before that, you can have a database branch of Alex that has some different data in it, whether it's like your production down in your testing or like just some test data or whatever you want to look at prior to that. You can say, okay, push this branch of data out there. And then Vercel can come in, right behind it to do the actual preview and run the site off of that branch. So it's quite incredible. I haven't spent enough time on it yet, but I saw it and loved it. And with full clarity when this comes out, hopefully. I just had an interview with him, so we'll see. We'll see what happens, folks. Stay tuned. Dominic Clark is over there, I found out, from Netlify, so doing some fun stuff.
That's cool. I mean, this looks really useful for like obviously test data, and I mean as someone who's kind of like working at a kind of like a startup now, but I've worked for kind of enterprisey companies in the past, and dealing with data is like you would never deal with like your actual users' data in like test kind of branches or locally and stuff like that. So having it almost like there's if there's a permissions kind of situation where you can safeguard some of your data and then be a little bit looser with kind of test branches, that would be really cool because and the other thing is like when you're doing kind of full end-to-end testing, spinning up kind of new kind of fresh databases, whatever you're using, if you're using AWS or GCP or whatever, like it can be pretty slow like at times depending on what your data store is. Totally. So having a really nice quick way to create to seed some data in a database fresh for testing, having that kind of nice, clean environment every time you run your tests as well is super cool. So that looks really interesting.
Yeah, it's really neat. I'm excited about it for sure. Okay, your stuff. It's AI stuff. So I mean, it's all the hot trend. Tell me about Hugging Chat.
Yeah. So my pick is open source AI in general, I guess. Like,
Yeah.
so I work for Hugging Face on an open source library called Gradio.
Oh yeah, maybe I should
And
bring up your main site first before I get too far here.
yeah, so
There we go.
Hugging Face is we're trying to, it's fully open source, and like we host models and data sets. We have a bunch of services and APIs. We can host like spaces, which are little kind of machine learning applications, and a lot of them are built with Gradio, which is what I work on, which is kind of a Python library to build web UIs basically. And the front end is built in Svelte, and the back end is in Python. And we're very kind of big on open source AI. Obviously, everything is like Hugging Face are behind the Transformers library, the Python Transformers library, which is a huge library in the machine learning community, and we have a bunch of open source libraries as well. And but my pick is kind of just in general open source AI, specifically open source LLMs. So there's been a lot of
Can you break down what's the LLM part?
Yeah, so it's I was ChatGPT has obviously taken over the world.
Yeah.
GPT 3.5 or GPT-4 like soon, and an LLM is just it's a large language model, and it's a relatively general purpose model, and fundamentally all a large language model does is kind of guesses what the next word should be or the next token should be. It's just it's almost like trying to finish your sentence, but after you've kind of trained it on that data, you then there's this kind of voting kind of process that the responses go through. So it kind of learns which kinds of response are more helpful. And then what you end up with is something like ChatGPT, which has read the internet kind of after a fashion.
Yeah.
It's never been trained on an enormous amount of data. And, you can talk to it. It's you can basically have this. It has enough of an understanding of language, which is like what it's kind of predominantly good at, that it can respond to you to varying degrees of accuracy. A lot of the hype around LLMs is a little bit like overstated. It's not, like I say, it's kind of doesn't know anything. It's kind of guessing. It can't verify anything. It will make stuff up. So you need to be very careful when you're using them at all times. But obviously, ChatGPT is closed source, and a very closed source is about as closed source as anything gets. And it is free for most people to use. You can use the chat. But the APIs you have to pay for, and they're not particularly cheap. So
they'll try to push you into the pro all the time.
yeah, absolutely. And it's been for kind of people within AI, there's almost been an existential kind of crisis, and like, oh my God, this is taking the world by storm, and it's like everything else has been kind of pushed by the wayside. But I think what's interesting to note is that there's nothing stopping other people from doing what OpenAI have done. It's really they've just kind of thrown, it's very, very good, and the impact has been enormous. But technically, it's not like a huge step. There's like lots and lots of data that has been put into that. So people will catch up, and the open source community is catching up. And the kind of the large language model that comes to mind today is Open Assistant. And you can try Open Assistant on this Hugging Chat. It's huggingface.co/chat. And, and it's kind of a GPT-like experience, where GPT chat-like experience, where you can ask it some questions and it will, try and respond to you. It's not as good at the minute as ChatGPT, but it's getting there, and it will continue to improve over time. And the nice thing about this kind of Hugging Face chat is that as new large language models are released, and more will be released over the coming kind of months, we are going to kind of add those models to this chat, so you can swap and try different models. And of course, the nice thing about these models is you can download them, you can run them locally, you can host them yourself, and there's lots of interesting work going on as well in the open source community around running large language models on your phone, which a lot of people thought would be very difficult because of resources, running them potentially like, I don't know, web GPU there's just been a big kind of hoo-ha around web GPU. So using kind of those kinds of web platforms to run them, and more besides, really kind of slimming down these models so they can run on, less ridiculous hardware, like the kind of hardware that is required to run something like GPT-3 and the other OpenAI models is absurd. It would bankrupt you overnight if you tried to have that kind of like clusters of high-end kind of AI-specific GPUs. Whereas the open source community obviously wants to run this stuff locally. They want to run it on little servers and things like that. So in a time when it feels like, with whether it's OpenAI or it's Google with Bard or it's like Microsoft or, lots and lots of people coming out with offerings and products, I think that fundamentally there's nothing stopping the open source community from catching up and potentially exceeding, because if there's something open source that's just as good and free, like what's going to win? So I think like keep an eye on the open source community. I think it's gonna we are betting, like Hugging Face are betting on it. I'm very passionate about open source in general, so I'm betting on open source AI to genuinely kind of democratize like AI in a way that these private kind of walled gardens kind of won't. And I also think that from in a very kind of like the serious side of all this is like the ethics and the safeguards around these things. And I do think that like doing things in the open is much kind of better for having a kind of like an open discussion around the dangers and the harms, the potential harms of these kinds of these tools and technologies. And I do think that doing things in the open is important to have those conversations, which so it's kind of I think open source AI is my pick, but specifically the large language models that will come out and improve over the next few months. I think we'll start to see more and more of that maturing, I think.
I have a feeling I already know your answer, but with Twitter and like locking down their API, even from like education side of things, do you think that like things like that will start to occur once we're past like, hey, we have these LLMs and we understand how to use them, and open source community builds them so far up, and then all of a sudden it's like everyone needs money again? Do you think it'll have that same effect, like Twitter kind of shutting down APIs unless you want to spend $42,000 a month or whatever crazy amount it is?
I mean, I don't know. The Twitter situation is unique because it feels like he's trying to destroy it. It's almost like self-sabotage. But I don't know. I think what interests me in particular is, so if you're a big, like if you want to take OpenAI as the obvious example, if you're a big company with huge amounts of funding, but also basically backed by Microsoft at this point, who are a cloud provider. So like this idea of like slimming down their models and making them super efficient and getting them to run on kind of pretty kind of like average hardware is just not that's not something they're interested in. They're currently like they're running huge clusters of very, very kind of like high performance GPUs, which are like one of those GPUs would cost you thousands and thousands per month if you were to rent one from AWS. And so the open source community, like a lot of them know this, right? So when they're kind of building these models, they're kind of thinking in terms of like, well, people don't have a supercomputer at home to to run things on. How can we get stuff to run? And the other nice thing about the open source community is a lot of people are interested in different things. They've got different skills, different expertise. So some people, there's always been this kind of the developments have always gone in two directions in kind of machine learning. One has been like new capabilities, like new models, interesting approaches that kind of allow us to do things we couldn't do before. And then the other side of that is kind of making those models more and more efficient. So like they become like less resource intensive, so that you could run them on your computer. You could run them on kind of like in some cases a phone. And I think that's where it gets really interesting. When you've got like something like ChatGPT that can run on your phone or something locally and no data is being sent anywhere. So from a privacy point of view, it's really kind of powerful. But also just like from a speed point of view, it could be like really, really nice. And I think this is what's interesting is there is lots of work happening in how to optimize things so that you can run them on like, much, much kind of like, lower end hardware, the kind of consumer hardware that people actually have access to. And I think the variety that kind of is going on, the amount of different kind of projects there are currently, open source projects that, well, yes, they're behind, but like that are coming. I think it'll make for a kind of a good, rich ecosystem. I think there'll be lots of competition even within those kind of projects, as people kind of compete against one another and learn from one another and collaborate within the open source community, something that obviously isn't going to happen between, I don't know, Google and OpenAI when there's so much money at stake. So I'm hoping that that kind of process wins out and it becomes a very kind of like open, you can choose what you use, you can choose where you run it, where you host it. Obviously, like Hugging Face has infrastructure that we sell, but if you wanted to go to Azure or you wanted to go to GCP, that kind of portability, no one else can give you that. Only really like open source can give you that. You see this with vendor lock-in with other things as well. And this is another thing that becomes a concern is, but if I fall out, if you're an enterprise company and you fall out with your whatever you're using, can you just switch to someone else? Well, no, in the case of OpenAI or something. But if you're using something that's open source and it's good, you can switch provider, you can find efficiencies and that kind of thing.
Hopefully someone else less expensive or market swap type thing. Yeah, that's a great point. Well, we could probably talk about this all day. It's a whole nother podcast for sure. But I just want to thank you, Pngwn, for kind of showing me everything about MDSvex and just in general for jumping on so quickly. I really appreciate it. And I can't wait to see the next version. Like I said, let me know. I'll help you out with the docs.
That's great. Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Absolutely. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.